As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
All right, this is the Gangster Report, second episode. Al Prophet, Scott Bernstein. Today we're going to be talking about Detroit Mafia and a documentary Scott and I did together a couple years ago called Detroit Mob Confidential, and a lot of updates on what's going on with the Detroit Mob, courtesy of Scott. So, Scott, tell us about, when did we do Mob Confidential, 09?
Yeah, we did it about 5 years ago, and I think it came out well. I was real proud of it. I think that I've gotten a lot of compliments, not just from people from Detroit, but from people outside the state, that I think it's an incredibly comprehensive and really intriguing view into a crime family that's in a lot of ways an anomaly, just in terms of the success and stability they've encountered.
So, for people that are used to just hearing about the five families and maybe the Chicago outfit, what makes the Detroit family unique, and why is it so interesting? Well, there's a lot of things that make it unique. What's a few of them?
For the most part, the family is actually a blood family. They're all intermarried. Back in the 1920s and 30s, when the family's quote-unquote founding fathers, Joe Zerilli and Black Bill Tocco, took over, they really encouraged, almost mandated that all their lieutenants marry other lieutenants' sisters, other administrators' sons, or sons and daughters and sons, marrying off their daughters to their sons, and it just became very genealogically intertwined.
And a lot of them lived kind of in the same.
And there was like a compound in Grosse Pointe, which before the Italians moved in was all very white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. No Catholics had ever really been in that city.
Yeah, let me give a little addendum to what Scott said. Grosse Pointe is to this day wealthier than Beverly Hills. It was for a long time possibly America's most elite suburb. The heirs of the Ford family, the other auto barons lived there. There was no Catholics, certainly no Jewish, no blacks. They were some of they might have been the first non-WASPs to move in, and the entire hierarchy of the Detroit family had almost like a whole block, multiple houses. There's rumors that they were connected by underground tunnels, and they lived a very closed-off kind of life there in America's most elite suburb.
Yeah, it was called the Compound, and it spanned not just Middlesex Avenue, but Devonshire and Balfour as well. Those three streets all kind of intersected and bordered each other, and it was like a city within a city in a lot of ways. Another thing that sets apart the Detroit family is probably a result, or one of the results of all the intermarriage, is just the stability the family has achieved over the years. There's only been one made member to ever flip and turn against the family, become a witness for the government, enter the witness protection program.
Can't say that about any of the New York families. They've had bosses turn.
Yeah, New York and Philadelphia, areas like New England, just a lot of turncoats. Chicago has only had one made guy, I believe, also turn, but they've had a ton of top-tier associates. Detroit is just very limited in the amount of rats they've had. And then related to the fact that they've had such a limited turncoat contingent, and you add that to all the intermarriage, you just haven't had a lot of intra-family conflicts, no storming the palace, if you will. There was one minor dust-up in the early 1960s that resulted from a transfer of power. The new guard, led by the Giacalone Brothers, kind of taken over from the old guard, led by guys like Pete Licavoli and Santo Perone. But that was very minor in scope, and for the most part, you've only had four godfathers now of the family. There's just been a recent change of power, but the Tocco Zerilli name in this family led the organized crime syndicate in Detroit from 1931 all the way until 2014.
80 years of the same two families. Yeah. And another totally unique thing about the Detroit family, which we talk about a lot in Detroit Mob Confidential, which is available on Gangster Report to watch. the entire hierarchy of the families that formed what was called the Detroit Combination in the early 1930s, all the sons, I think without exception, or maybe there must have been one exception, went to college.
You got business degrees or accounting degrees.
From places like Notre Dame, very prestigious schools, and came back and got involved in the family business. And I have an interesting personal anecdote. A good friend of mine who's Greek, his grandfather, excuse me, his grandfather was involved in running numbers in Detroit's so-called Greektown in the 1950s. And his boss, a guy by the name of Gus Andromulus, was strangled to death as part of the Italian power grab in Greektown for the gambling. And due to Scott's research with his FBI contacts, we actually have been told that the two sons of the founding fathers of the family, Jack Tocco, who recently died, who was the godfather for over 30 years of the family, and Tony Zerilli, who Scott's actually working on a book with now. We were told that those two guys made their bones in the late 1940s after they graduated from college, came home, told their fathers they wanted to be in a family business, and they're the ones who strangled Gus Andromulus to death while their fathers watched.
Yeah, they took turns taking a rope around Gus's neck in a basement of an apartment in northwest Detroit in 1947. They were subsequently made into the family in 1949 in a ceremony where they both got their button. And I think when Al really hit it on the head when he talked about maybe the most unique, in addition to the stability and the intermarriage, probably the most unique factor of the Detroit family is that you had multiple, half dozen, if not more, younger sons, lieutenants of the hierarchy that were groomed not just on the street, but not just blue collar, but white collar as well, went and got college business degrees and really used that boardroom acumen to advance the family's prestige agenda. And, we're able to kind of nestle their way into the legitimate business world in a way, or in ways that a lot of other families maybe still haven't. And we're talking back in the 1950s. And then you had a guy like Mike Polizzi, Big Mike Polizzi, eventually became the consigliere of the family, who went and got an accounting degree from Syracuse, and he became, the numbers whiz that, the higher powers gave all the money, and he invested it into businesses, hid the stuff he needed to hide, and just did a very good job of playing with those numbers.
And then moving into the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and into now, the Detroit family is also unique in that has a lot of very high-ranking, of course not made men because they're not Italian, but associates that were Middle Eastern. Detroit is one of the, up until recently, I think Detroit had the largest Middle Eastern community in the country. Also, a lot of black gangsters were tied in behind the scenes, being supplied with heroin by the Detroit Mafia. And there's an interesting character, Freddie the Pope Salem. He was a Syrian guy. He died recently. He was kind of the gambling czar in tandem with Alan Hilf, a.k.a. the general, who was Jewish. So you have a Syrian and a Jewish guy that are really overseeing the Detroit Mafia's entire gambling operation, which was massive, to say the least. In the early 1980s, there was a huge indictment of the Detroit family for controlling the illegal numbers business, primarily in Detroit's black community, and it was estimated to be a $250 million a year business in Metro Detroit alone. The black numbers banks got the daily number from the Detroit Mafia, and the Detroit Mafia supplied the bank to pay off in the police protection, and etc.
Yeah, another great point by Al. The equal opportunity nature of this crime family has really boded well and created. They're very very adept at insulating themselves, putting buffers and layers in between
And
them.
they certainly picked the right guys, because none of those guys became turncoats.
And Alan mentioned two guys that are just legendary presences in the underworld that aren't Italian, one being Freddie Salem, a.k.a. the Pope, a.k.a. the Saint, a.k.a. Four-Horse Freddie, just someone that was beloved both by gangsters and even the cops. This guy was really a gentleman and really had good relationships with the law enforcement that had chased this guy forever, to the point where when he was dying in a nursing home a couple years ago, I got some phone calls from ex-DPD and some ex-FBI that wanted me to track down where Freddie was in the nursing home so they could go kind of pay their final respects. So that kind of speaks to what level of what high esteem Freddie Salem was held in. Alan Hilf was similar, the most powerful Jewish gangster probably in the Detroit area, post-Prohibition. Was considered one of the most intelligent and connected gambling czars in really the whole country. Was a bookie that had connections in New York and Los Angeles, and was someone that literally made millions and millions of dollars for his superiors in the mob. And to that point, he was very, very close, almost brothers with Jackalone, Jackie the Kid, the new boss of the family. We'll talk about that in a second, but a lot of people called him Hesh, a reference to the character in The Sopranos, and there's a parallel there in the sense that Hesh, the character, the Jewish gangster in The Sopranos, was really close with the Soprano brothers, Johnny Boy and Junior, back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and when their son, or when Johnny Boy's son, the fictional son, Tony Soprano, became of age, Hesh kind of became Tony's right-hand man and counselor, and it's kind of similar with Alan Hilf. Alan Hilf started off as a very trusted underling of the Giacalone Brothers, Vito Billy Jack and Anthony Tony Jack, and then when Vito's son Jackie began his rise in the family, he aligned with Alan, and Alan became his right-hand man / street counselor, almost. Not say almost. I would say he was at the level of a consigliere, and if he had been an Italian, he would have been a made guy and a very powerful made guy, and he would have been the consigliere. But Jackie looked at him and really trusted him.
One quick aside before we move on. I was working on a different documentary about called Rollin', the Fall of the Auto Industry and the Rise of the Drug Economy in Detroit. And I was interviewing, for background info, a guy who had been a prominent member of Young Boys Incorporated, which was kind of the standard bearer of black drug rings in the United States. In the 1970s, they started using 12-year-olds to sell drugs. They controlled like half the city. And I was sitting and talking with this guy, and he said, yeah, I had to go to a funeral yesterday. And I said, oh, who was it? And he said, I went to Freddie Salem's funeral. And I said, Freddie Salem, how do you know him? And he said, oh, he used to take all my bets, because the only people that could handle the action from the big black drug dealers in the 80s and 90s who had enough bank was the mafia. So you can kind of see how on the surface these things are all disconnected, but behind the scenes they're really all connected. Now, moving later on, two of the most iconic and interesting figures in the Detroit mob are the Giacalone Brothers, both of whom are recently deceased, but they're really dynamic, interesting characters. Scott, you want to?
Yeah, well, and also kind of doubling back to Hilf and connecting him to the black underworld that you just said. He was someone, or the Giacalone Brothers were, really embodied the equal opportunity mindset. They for Italians at the time period, having black gangsters work for them and mentored by them, and I don't think you saw that in a lot of other parts of the country. I think even if the black gangsters were working for the Italians, it was very far removed. But the Giacalone Brothers took a liking of a young, up-and-coming African-American racketeer named Francis Usher, who went by the nickname Big Frank Nitti, that was actually nicknamed by the Giacalone Brothers in honor of the Chicago mobster Frank Nitti. And they brought him up in the underworld from the time I believe he was 11, 12 years old, and put him on, so to speak. Lots of FBI personnel have told me that they on frequent occasions would see Alan Hilf delivering messages, delivering money, whatnot, to Frank Usher. And then we also heard from a pretty prominent attorney that all of Frank Usher's legal bills, and they were, he faced a capital murder case.
Well, he didn't just face a capital murder case. In 1979, there was an infamous triple murder in Detroit where the victims were all beheaded. And it was kind of iconic. That was at the time when Detroit was known as the Murder City. And Frank Nitti was one of the people convicted of this. So he had triple life, no parole, in Michigan State Prison. And coincidentally, around the time when Tony Giacalone got out of prison for serving his own federal time for an extortion case, suddenly a bunch of money became available for Frank Nitti's appeal. And he, in fact, got his triple murder conviction overturned. And
we've heard from people that the Jackalones were paying all of Frank Usher's legal bills, and again, money being delivered to the lawyer by a Mr. Alan Hilf. So, the Giacalone brothers were the face of the Detroit Mafia, even though the Zerilli and Tocco family were the traditional leaders and kind of puppet masters behind the curtain. The Giacalone brothers were the ones that on the street, the ones that were laying the law, the ones that were the quote-unquote street bosses. They had day-to-day authority of the family. They only had to defer to their bosses, the Toccos or Zerillis, for policy decisions. But for the most part, the day-to-day affairs of the Detroit Mafia on the street from the late 1950s all the way into the 2000s were controlled by the Giacalones.
And these were old-school, hardcore Italians. They grew up in Detroit. Their father ran a fruit stand. Yeah, they were anomalous of being, they were the only important members of the Detroit family to really be brought in who weren't somehow related to the original family, but they were real tough guys. Tony Giacalone was supposedly the driver for the boss of the family, Joe Zerilli, at the Appalachian Conference in 1957 and helped him get away. The Detroit family.
I believe that actually the more research I've done, I believe there was two people with Joe Zerilli, one being Anthony Tony the Bull Corrado and the other being Anthony Tony Jack.
And they all got away.
And the story is that when the police raided the Appalachian state with the gathering of almost every prominent mobster in the country gathering for a conference of dons, when the state got raided, allegedly the story is that either Giacalone, Tony the Bull, or both of them literally picked up Joe Zerilli, physically picked him up and carried him through the woods in the back of the Appalachian estate to their car, and both of them got promoted as a result.
And the Detroit family was one of the few in the country that didn't get mixed up in the real debacle of the Appalachian meeting, which kind of exposed the national mafia to public scrutiny for the first time. Because remember, before Appalachia and Joe Valachi, FBI Director Herbert Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover. Before the Appalachian and Joe Valachi debacle, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover said there was no mafia in the United States. Now, a lot of this stuff we go over more in depth in Detroit Mob Confidential. Moving forward kind of into the present time, what happened in the late 1990s that was kind of the first real big RICO case against the Detroit family?
Yeah, the FBI had been working on cases to bring down the hierarchy of the family for years, had been incredibly unsuccessful. There'd been patches here or there of guys having to go to jail, but no major sentences, no major RICOs. And in the early 1990s, they got a break by being able to not just flip a major and associate. Well, it was a brief flipping. Nonetheless, it was a flipping of Crazy John Pree, who was a Giacalone associate that debriefed, went in front of a grand jury, gave them a lot of information about the Detroit mob. He eventually recanted his testimony and recently just got out a story that is on Gangster Report right now. But in addition to that, they were able to bug the car of a soldier in the family, Nove Tocco, the nephew of Tony Zerilli, the cousin of Jack Tocco. And for about 2 years, Nove Tocco was driving around in his car, all bugged up,
extorting
FBI was listening.
Middle Eastern store owners who were running gambling operations.
Just extorting that, shaking down anything he can find, and then talking shop in the car, not just with his partner in crime, Paulie Corrado, but Tony Zerilli, his uncle at that time, the underboss of the family, spent a lot of time in that car, and he was on the tapes too. So when you combine what Pre gave them, along with the bug in the car and all the investigation the FBI had done dating back to the 1970s related to the Las Vegas casino skim. Everything came to a head in 1996. Giant indictment, took down the whole hierarchy of the family for the most part. The only major member of the hierarchy that did not get indicted in that was Little Vince Maley. But other than that, everyone else got indicted. All the boss, underboss, consigliere, all the capos, and with the exception of consigliere Tony Tocco, they were all convicted. Tony Jack, Billy Jack, Jack Tocco, Tony Zerilli, Big Mike Polizzi.
And here's where it gets interesting, and it shows you kind of the power of the Detroit family. So Jack Tocco, who was the boss at the time, who was the longest-serving boss of any mob family in the United States, he gets convicted specifically by the jury of being the leader of a criminal RICO organization called the Detroit Mafia family, and the federal judge sentences him to 1 year in prison. So the federal prosecutors were livid. They accused the judge of maybe being corrupt. The federal prosecutor got in trouble. There was a big back and forth. They sent Tocco back for resentencing multiple times, and eventually he did maybe 18 months in prison. And that kind of...
Well, meanwhile, the lower men on the totem pole in that bus, guys that were the street soldiers, guys that were delivering the orders issued by Jack Tocco, one of them got 13 years.
I thought he got 19.
Well, he got 9. He did 13. Paulie Corrado, who was Nove Tocco's partner, Nove flipped. Paulie was left hanging in the wind, and Paulie has been in jail from 2000 to 2012.
So, bring us up to date, Scott, on what's going on.
Let me just interject one thing. One other interesting part of that bust, the 1996 bust that resulted in convictions at trial in 1998, 2000, and 2002. There were 3 trials from that Operation GameTax case, which came down in 96. But one of the really the crux of that case was that not only were they claiming that Jack Tocco was the boss, they were claiming they had photos of the ceremony that anointed Jack as boss, and it really some real rare police work where they were able to, because of Jack Tocco's driver, they were kind of able to get a tip-off that in 1979, June of 1979, the Detroit family was going to get together at a luxury hunting lodge up by Ann Arbor, Michigan, that was owned by a mob family known as the Ruggiero family. And in fact, the patriarch of the Ruggiero family, Big Tony Ruggiero, was Black Bill Tocco, Jack Tocco's father's longtime driver and bodyguard. His sons, Louis Ruggiero and Tony Ruggiero Jr., owned the Timberland Game Ranch. The whole hierarchy of the Detroit family trekked up there on July 10th or July 11th, 1979, for a ceremony to anoint Jack Tocco the new boss. And the FBI, because they got the tip-off, was trailing behind them. An FBI agent by the name of Greg Stayskull took his camera and actually got up close to where the ceremony was taking place and snapped photos.
Only photo of a U.S. Mafia Godfather being made as the Godfather of any family. We have that picture in Detroit Mob Confidential if you want to check it out.
There was a famous photo that Al was referring to that had Jack Tocco being congratulated and surrounded by both Anthony Tony the Bull Corrado and Billy Jack Jackalones.
Now, what's going on right now? There's been a few interesting things to happen in the last year or so. Last summer, Tony Zerilli, former underboss of the family, got a lot of national news exposure by claiming to know where Jimmy Hoffa was buried. And recently the boss, Jack Tocco, died, and a new boss was made. And Scott, you're working actually with Tony Zerilli on a book. So tell us what's happened with the Detroit family since we did Detroit Mob Confidential.
Well, spawning from the 1996 Operation GameTax Bust, a huge rift between the boss and the underboss, Jack Tocco and Tony Zerilli, who were first cousins and one-time best friends, just erupted and put them on opposite sides of a very bitter dispute. Jack Tocco blamed Tony Zerilli for Nove Tocco's actions and really Jack really shunned Tony Z after that, demoted him, took his underboss stripes, put him on the shelf. When he came out of prison, when Tony Z came out of prison, he ended up having to do a 6-year stint, was broke and couldn't get his footing back in the Detroit underworld because Jack had made him persona non grata. Anyway, this feud festered for over a decade to the point where Tony Z finally, after just being continually rejected by Jack Tocco in any attempts to try to get some status back in the Detroit underworld, he decided that his only trump card would be to run to the FBI and try to implicate Jack Tocco in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance. So Tony Z went to the FBI in 2013. They ended up digging up a piece of property that had once been owned by Jack Tocco in suburban Detroit, Oakland County, and they were not able to find any remains of Hoffa. But
what do you think Tony Zerilli's motivation was in?
That was his motivation.
Do you think he believed it to be true?
I think he believed it to be true. I believe that Tony Zerilli was in prison at the time that Hoffa disappeared, and I believe that the people in Detroit had to come up with a story to tell Tony. I don't think they wanted to tell Tony exactly what happened, so they fed him a line. And he honestly thought that was where the body was buried, and he told the FBI that as he felt it was his only way to get back at Jack. And unfortunately, however you want to see it, Jack is the one who had the last laugh because there was no indictment, there was no finger pointed at him because it was a fruitless endeavor. So that happens. A year later, Jack Tocco dies. Peacefully in his home.
Which was a few months ago.
Right, because Jack Tocco died in July of 2014. He had prepared for his passing and kind of passed the torch in the family to Jackalone, Billy Jack's son, Jackie the Kid, who was a 60, I believe he was born in 1950, would make him 64 years old. He is been groomed for the throne for at least the last 25 years, someone who's been the street boss of the Detroit mob before he became the boss, since that GameTax bust and his uncle and his dad went to jail, so had been the street boss for a good 12 to 15 years. Took over as Don this past summer, and it's kind of something that's been almost preordained that Jackie was going to take over, and the Jackalones would take the power from the Tocco Zerilli family. And finally, after all those years of being the face on the street, now they got their name on the marquee.
So, what is the Detroit family probably involved in today? Is it mostly just gambling? I mean, are they still involved in serious crimes like heroin? Probably not. Just probably gambling.
Gambling, extortion,
loan
sharking, maybe a little bit of drugs. But the heyday of organized crime in America is well past, and the point where the organized crime factions had their tentacles in every nook and cranny of society is really a bygone era. But for the mafia being the way it is today, the Detroit family, at least right now in 2014, is incredibly functional, and
they have a lot of legal businesses.
A lot of legal businesses, a lot of ties into both the political and white collar community of Detroit. So you have Jackie as the new boss. He's named his cabinet, so to speak, Anthony Chicago Tony LaPiana, who was a protege of Jack Tocco, is now the new underboss, and allegedly, and Anthony Tony Palazzola, a.k.a. the Butterfly, is the new consigliere. He is a protege of Greektown mob bosses, the Vitali brothers.
All right, so this has been Gangster Report, second episode, Detroit Mob Confidential. Check out gangsterreport.com and Detroit Mob Confidential. Scott has one more thing.
Let me say there are two articles right now recently posted on organized crime in Detroit on Gangster Report. One is talking about the release of Crazy John Pree, who's recently been released from prison after doing 20 years or so. And then there's another article, on Tommy Lackey, a.k.a. Tommy the Lackey Mackey, a.k.a. the Leprechaun. He is a Irish Detroit mob associate, very close to Pete Tocco, who's now the new street boss. And Tommy just took a gambling bust recently. And then there's also some new information about the Tocco family, Nove Tocco, the turncoat, the one who went into witness protection, allegedly has returned to Detroit in recent years, was driving a bus for an independent bus company, and allegedly recently just got fired from that bus company.
No, that was a bus company that drove, mentally disabled or handicapped?
Elderly, mentally disabled people, and according to what I heard,
he was stealing their money.
He was stealing their money. Just an aside, to me, it's a pretty... the Detroit mob doesn't make a habit of whacking people out in the open, and they're not a very brazen cowboy-like family. But for Nove Tocco to come back here, and I know he's being sparse. He's not someone who's going to all the hot spots, but still, it's something that I look at, and I don't think it's probably the best way to. It's not the best course of action for Nove Tocco, in my opinion.
Gangster Report. Al Prophet, Scott Bernstein.
So say good night to the bad guy. Go on. The last time you're going to see a bad guy like this again, let me tell you.